So I had some people send me this thing. Apparently, the New York Times is reposting a rejected report saying that refugees have on net contributed $63 billion more in revenue than they cost. And this is an interesting thing, and I think it's worth talking about, but it's not something that I can make really a whole video about, or a proper video about, so I'm just going to do like a little chat up on this. I wrote down a few things. So I read through the report. I'm not going to say I read, read every bit about it. I'll say I read through it. And so what they're looking at is refugees, as in people legally classified as refugees. Whether they really fit the true colloquial definition of refugee is another question. But these are legally classified refugees between 2005 and 2014. And there were 2,888,711 of those. And this report is looking at a sample of 18,316. So they're inferring from a sample. This is not census data. So, and I'll just say this. I'm looking at their sort of what they're saying in terms of the fiscal impact based on the median income. So according to this paper, refugees who have been in the United States for 10 years or more, that's important, 10 years or more, had a median income of $59,600 in 2014. The paper also said that the average refugee household paid roughly $21,818 more in taxes than they got back in government services over the past 10 years. This averages out to $2,182 net taxpayer per household per year from these refugee populations. Now, going back to my post where I looked at the fiscal impact of racial groups in the United States, I came to the number that in 2014, whites paid about $2,795 per capita more in taxes than they got from the government. And the median income of whites was $60,256 in 2014. So this number that this paper is coming up with is very plausible. If refugees in the United States did in fact make $59,600 per capita in 2014, then we would expect them to be net taxpayers about as much as whites are in 2014. But also consider that it's 10 years in for these people. So there's going to be years back, especially when they've just got off the boat, well, just got off the plane. They don't really come in barges, boats anymore. At least not to, well, let's not get into that. But when they first come to the United States, they're going to be a little bit poor. They're not going to have the same revenues, and they're not going to pay the same amount in taxes. So we could expect a few years when they first arrive in the United States for them to be sort of break even in terms of paying taxes, or even be net takers very early on. Typically, I know from just immigrants, period, not legally classified refugees, but immigrants, period, they typically end up paying, there's about a $3,000 swing from first generation to second generation in terms of net tax payment, that they end up being a net taxpayer $3,000 more from what their parents were in the first generation. So if their parents, are net takers of $6,000, the second generation is going to be a net taker of about $3,000. That's, just kind of a rule of thumb, the effect. So in terms of refugees, what's the effect going to be over a 10-year period? Now, I think just as groups of people, first off, the average income that these people in the sample are making, $59,600 a year, this is very close to the white number. This is higher than blacks. This is higher than Hispanics. Okay, so refugees make more than those two groups as immigrant groups, right? That's the first thing to consider. So I'm looking at this paper here, and there's so on the one hand, I have to kind of believe the results because these are very plausible results for the net fiscal impact of these refugees. And I say that because they match up with the numbers I got from whites, and their median income is very close to whites, and we'd expect the refugees to pay a little bit less on average over 10 years simply because they're going to be a little bit poor when they first arrive, so that would account for the little bit of the gap. But I sort of have to believe this report's data, at least in terms of the sample they're looking at. Of course, the question is does the sample extrapolate onto the rest of the refugee population? Another problem I would say with this report, and if I was Trump, which is why I would reject this report and say this report doesn't get to be published, is I would demand a breakdown of each groups. Because when you're doing immigration policy, you're not bringing in quote-unquote refugees, right? You're bringing in Somali refugees. You're bringing in Vietnamese refugees. You're bringing in Cuban refugees, right? Or you're bringing in Nigerian, right? You're bringing in specific, right? You're bringing in real people, right? And you can class them as refugees, sure, but you're bringing in what's actually out there. There's no country called refugee that all the refugees come from, right? What's actually out there are real people, and you need to disambiguate. And so a number that says something that says refugees have contributed to the economy this much, it's like, okay, but what they're really saying is that Vietnamese and Cubans and people from the former Soviet Union have contributed a lot to the United States economy. That doesn't necessarily mean that Somalis are going to do so. Doesn't necessarily mean that even Nigerians are going to do so. Now you could say, well, specific groups within Nigeria, some people from some certain tribes, right? You can always thin slice any population to a way where you can get black Africans are net contributors, right? Just go down to Africa, give a bunch of IQ tests, find the blacks who score an IQ of 100 or higher within sub-Saharan Africa. They come to the United States, environmental improvements will raise their IQ another 15 points, and now they're at 115, right? The average IQ of Africa is like 70. Bring them to the United States, they'll probably be, 80 to 90. It's hard to say how, depending on how much of that's genetic or environmental, but it's going to be somewhere 80, 90 if they get proper Western environment. It's 70 when they're in their own environment. But the thing is, any immigrant group you bring over, could be a thin slice to be some elite population, right? And the danger in that, and that people look at that and say, oh, look, we basically brain drained the smartest people from Nigeria, and they're net contributors to this society that we're in, to Italian society, for example. And then you could have some really bad people, or really stupid people, and just really evil people who say, well, let's bring in, let's just mass immigrate from Nigeria. But the general population of Nigeria is not necessarily going to represent the kinds of people who you brought in previously, okay? Especially, for example, the biggest group in this study are Vietnamese. Now, Vietnamese, these are people who fled from a war, okay? These are refugees these are sort of the boat people who got on a boat to go to the United States in response to war situations. So these are going to be people who found a way out, right? So you're going to expect a little bit of selection for the people who figured out how to get to the United States, right? That's the first problem with the refugee population. There's just all sorts of reasons why you need to be very careful when looking at, saying refugees have contributed XYZ amount. And there's also that issue with immigrants. People want to bring in immigrants, and immigrants have been, are less criminal than the native population, or illegal immigrants are less criminal than the native population, and it's like. And the thing about that, first off, it's like what they typically do is they take people who have been in the U.S. for 10 years and compare it to people who have been in the U.S. for 30 years and say, look, people who have been in the U.S. for 30 years, they commit more crimes. They're not, and they're never factoring race. They're just looking at immigrant data. I did a post where I basically showed that Hispanic immigrants end up being as criminal as native-born Hispanics, black immigrants as criminals as native-born blacks, And this is based on longitudinal data. You see as the immigrants have stayed in the U.S. longer and longer and longer, their percentage of them that have committed some sort of felony trends towards that for the general population of their race, right? So Hispanic immigrants end up being as criminal as native-born Hispanics. The problem is when they first arrive into the U.S., they have a clean slate, right? When you first arrive to the United States, you haven't committed any crimes in the United States. It takes years for those to sort of rack up under your belt. And as a result, the immigrant community ends up looking a lot cleaner than it really is, simply because they haven't had the time to have their criminality documented, right? So that's a problem with those immigrant, low crime immigrant stats. And there's all sorts of problems here. But I just wanted to make a post sort of addressing this. I guess this is a little bit nice because I can say, oh, look, whoever wrote this report, I forget the name of the people who wrote this report, but whoever wrote this report, their numbers for fiscal impact relative to the median income of the group you're looking at is very similar to what I got when I was doing the fiscal impact by racial group in the United States. So there's a little bit of... So this sort of confirms sort of what I'm doing, sort of my assumptions with the equal government and then the distributed fiscal impacts of the various services, the various welfares, and so not a lot of conclusions to make here. It's kind of muddled. I would just say, if some shitlib brings this up, one thing I would say is that the refugees in this paper do not necessarily match. First off, refugees in this paper don't necessarily match refugees going forward. This is a documentation of the past. This does not mean that even refugees you bring in are going to be as productive as these people were. That's the first thing. The second thing is, when talking about mass immigration, you're not talking about refugee status. You're talking about the hordes, right? You're talking about a much wider net of people that you're bringing in. Okay, so this doesn't even apply to mass immigration. So that's just how I would respond to this. Also, the sample may be wrong. The sample may be non-representative. I don't know enough about refugee populations in the United States to know whether the sample they use is accurate or not, but that could be an issue. But just generally, the real problem with this report I see is that the way it's going to be used. And it's going to be used to draw conclusions. It's going to be used to say things that this report just doesn't say, right? And they're going to try to go well beyond the bounds of what this report says. That's really the issue. And that's why I wouldn't approve it being released to the public, because I know how the public would use it. They would use it in a dishonest way, and so the most honest thing you could do is not show it. I don't know if that's why whoever in the Trump administration put the nix on this did so. I don't know why they did that, but I'm just saying why I would not show it if I were king. So, all right, I need to end this, and I'll go ahead and end this here.